Welcome back to part 2 of Critical History's series on the 1453 Siege of Constantinople. Undoubtedly the most epic, massive siege in history. By mid-May 1453, the siege had reached a stalemate. But before we discuss the factors that led to its conclusion, let's take a minute to talk about strategies the Ottomans employed, and why the Byzantines' Western allies were unable to intervene. Most people are probably familiar with the story of the Siege of Vienna, the second one, in 1683. Who came to the rescue? The Polish hussars, of course. So where were the hussars and Hungarians during the Siege of Constantinople? As direct neighbors, they had the most to lose from the Ottomans' rise to power. Well, their military capabilities had been devastated by Mehmet's father, Murad, and specifically at the Battle of Varna, some years earlier. Mehmed invaded Thessalonica before the siege, and this kept the Greeks busy. France and England were just wrapping up the 100 Years' War at this time as well, a topic that deserves its own video. Bohemia, as one of the strongest states in the Holy Roman Empire, was without a king, and the rest of the principalities were heavily divided. So sending soldiers at a time when your neighbors weren't, is basically suicidal. Realistically, who did that leave? Just Spain and Italy. Castile and Aragon had not yet been unified into a single state at this time, and the Reconquista was still far from over. Italy was also heavily divided. But here is something I learned in just the last few days. Niccolo Barbaro, a Venetian who was inside the city during the siege, wrote an eyewitness account of the event. And he says the Genoese were supporting the Ottomans. The Genoese were supporting the Ottomans. That, for example, they revealed to the Ottomans Byzantine and Venetian plans to attack their navy. He also says, though, that the Byzantines and Venetians didn't figure out the Genoese were in cahoots with the Ottomans until afterwards. It's difficult for me to even put into words how much research I have done into this time period without coming across this crucial piece of information. This would also explain why the Genoese colonies in the Crimean Peninsula were left alone for a further 20-odd years. I also want to make one other point. Just about everyone who has studied medieval trade routes knows about the Italian colonies in the Crimea. But if I were to flip that around and suggest the Crimeans had colonies in the Italian peninsula, people would think I'm crazy. Want another example? We readily admit that Vikings reached the New World, but to think that someone could have sailed from northern Russia to Norway, Scotland, Iceland, and then to the New World? Crazy. It's probably 8 days worth of sailing from Archangelisk to Tromsø in those days. So not a day trip by any means, but along the coast the whole way. And with favorable winds, easily doable. So back to the Genoese. Were they playing both sides, hedging their bets? Or were they in bed with the Ottomans all along? That is difficult to say definitively, but it is also worth mentioning that there were pro-Ottoman factions within the city itself, and that Mehmet's top vizier was actually suggesting to him to call off the siege. So it's worth considering if he hadn't been bribed with a view to getting Mehmet to call off the siege. What's interesting is that immediately upon conclusion of the siege, that vizier was executed. Again, turning to the work of Fomenko, he suggests not only did Russian soldiers take part in the siege, but that Muscovy had strained relations with the Byzantines, but once the Ottomans came to power, they had close diplomatic and trade relations with the city once again. Which, if the Ottomans were enemies of the Orthodox Church, would make little to no sense. Going back to the account of Niccolo Barbaro, he specifically mentions that there were Christians comprising upwards of 1/3 of the Ottoman army, but he insists they were there against their will. although he also refers to the Ottomans as faithless Turks. Alright, so what strategies did the Ottomans employ, besides defeating the Hungarians at Varna and keeping the Greeks occupied in Thessalonica? Well, one of their masterstrokes was avoiding the boom chain by portaging their boats overland. It seems they weren't able to move the largest ships in their navy this way, but a great number of the medium-sized galleys were portaged. This strikes me as a distinctly Russian strategy to adopt. Why do I say that? Because portaging boats was very much a fact of life at this time in Russia. Boats were routinely portaged the massive distance between the Don and Volga rivers. So not only was the siege a land battle, it was also a sea battle. At sea, though, the Byzantines and their Venetian allies were able to withstand the Ottoman offensive, probably due to having larger boats and greater naval expertise. But the Ottomans were successful in that the city of Constantinople had to spread out its troops to defend its weak sea walls. Another strategy that was used, in this case to motivate the Ottoman soldiers, was that Mehmet claimed to have found the grave of a previous military leader that was said to have come close to capturing the city. There's nothing quite like the discovery of a religious relic to stir up the patriotism and religious fervor of the troops. The Ottomans also employed sappers, diggers intending to literally undermine the city's walls. This explains why not many attempts were made at a full-scale assault in the first few weeks of the siege. The Ottomans knew that if the sappers succeeded, it would make taking the city much easier. But there were ways to detect sappers. Apparently something as simple as a copper sheet hung against a castle wall will rattle if there's digging nearby. So the Byzantines were able to employ counter-sappers, which basically entails digging a tunnel that intersects your enemy's tunnel and then collapsing it by burning their wooden supports or with barrels of gunpowder. The Ottomans were also apparently able to build a massive wooden tower which allowed them to shoot arrows at those defending the city's walls from an advantageous position. But the tower had to be reinforced so that it could withstand cannon fire, and as a result it could not be moved nor used for transporting soldiers to the top of the walls. The Byzantines built improvised fortifications wherever they were unable to repair the walls, and this proved rather effective. Day in and day out, though, the bombardment continued. Not to be underestimated is the psychological toll this took on those defending the city. While those besieging knew full well when they were to attack, those defending Constantinople had to basically be in a state of constant readiness. It is said that the people of Constantinople had a number of prophecies regarding when the city would fall. The city would fall to troops from the east, when they had an emperor who was son of Helen, and when the full moon had made a sign. Constantine XI was indeed son of Helen. The lunar eclipse seemed to be the sign they feared, and a bulk of the Ottoman soldiers were indeed from the east. So after the eclipse, and after the strange hailstorm and thick fog, the Ottomans knew it was now or never. 1 week later, they readied their major assault. May 29th, 1453, the Ottomans attacked in waves, with Mehmet himself directing the attack on the breach. It seems they targeted an area of Constantinople's walls that had been repaired or that was using the improvised fortifications, and once they targeted that, they were able to create a breach in short order. And by continuing to focus their bombardment in this area, they were able to prevent the Byzantines from repairing it. The final wave of soldiers were, of course, the Janissaries. The strongest, best equipped, bravest, and freshest of all the Ottoman soldiers, having been basically held in reserve until this moment. Having fended off the first 2 waves of attacks, the Byzantine soldiers were already fatigued and likely wounded by the time the Janissaries made their way onto the walls. Is there anything more exhausting than intense hand-to-hand combat? And in the case of a siege of this magnitude, merely holding your own against your opponent is not enough if more and more attackers keep storming through the breaches or climbing on top of the walls. After a few hours of fighting, the Ottomans had captured the outer line of walls, and soon it swelled with 60,000 soldiers. It's also important to keep in mind the scope of the city, because the land walls are about 5 miles or 8 kilometers from the furthest east part of the city, so it's not that easy from a logistical standpoint to move troops from one area of the walls to another. And likewise for the soldiers that stormed the walls, once they were inside the city, they were still more than an hour's walk from the palaces and the most prosperous parts of the city, which they intended to loot. It seems that as soon as news of this massive setback reached the ears of the citizens, panic, understandably, set in. I'm not sure why they weren't confident of holding the second line of walls, but it could be that it had been breached in multiple places by the 5 weeks of bombardment. The Byzantines started fleeing for their lives, and those who could boarded boats and sailed away with whatever they could carry. It seems the sailors in the Ottoman fleet were so preoccupied with grabbing their share of the city's loot that they disembarked from their ships and simply allowed the Byzantines to sail past. The Ottomans started going house to house, looting and pillaging. Women and children were taken prisoner, and the men, for the most part, were slaughtered. This may seem cruel, but it was standard protocol for a successful medieval siege, because it was understood before a siege began that a city had 2 options: surrender and be spared, or resist, and if the siege was successful, the sound must have been terrifying. Cannons firing, shouting, war cries, cries of pain and anguish, warning bells ringing constantly. Soon, every house and tower in the city had an Ottoman flag flying from its roof, signifying that it had already been or was being looted. Tradition stated that a successful siege meant looting by soldiers was allowed to continue for 3 full days, which provided a chance to find hidden and buried treasures. But Mehmed halted the sack of the city after just 1 day, because he wanted to make Constantinople his new capital. Mehmed then set about doing all he could to encourage immigration to the city, even going as far as to deport people from other parts of the empire. After the victory, Mehmed styled himself Kaiser-i-Rum. In other words, the Caesar of Rome. Within 50 years, now simply called Istanbul, or the city, it was once again the largest city in Europe. And 30 years later, in his last days, Mehmed even planned an invasion of Italy. As for the siege's long-term impacts, an in-depth look at that will have to wait for another day. But if you've watched some of the other videos on this channel, you already know some of them. The start of the Age of Exploration and the height of the Italian Renaissance. Is it possible it also influenced the English War of the Roses? Next up on Critical History though, a series on the 100 Years' War. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hit that like, subscribe, and check out my book, a work of historical fiction about the advent of early gunpowder weapons in the Holy Roman Empire in the late 13th century, Conquest of Truth. Until next time, you know what to do. Stay critical.